Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to the second episode of the Wise Mind Fireside Chats, or in short, Wi-Fi. And I'm really, really happy to announce today some wonderful guests because we are going to talk about a sensitive subject, which is trauma. And today I have here Alec Wells and Melanie Holmes, both psychologists who have had experience of trauma and are also working with trauma clients, because the idea of today's podcast is to get away from the textbooks, to get away from the usual definitions of trauma and get real and actually talk about experiences and maybe some unusual knowledge which is usually not taught in school or universities. So I'm really, really pleased and welcome Alec and Melanie to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you,
So
Gaby.
the first question really is, because you're both working with trauma clients, what is it which actually drew you to working with trauma clients? What's the passion behind it?
Okay, do you want me to go first, Gaby? Yeah, for me, I think it's being that person that wasn't there for me when I needed them. Often when people go through trauma, it's exacerbated by the fact that they don't have at that time the support network that they need. And there have been occasions, I've been through a number of different traumatic experiences, and there's been occasions where I've had support and there's been occasions when I've not had support, and I can definitely say those occasions when I didn't have that support network around me, it made recovering from the trauma so much more difficult. It took much longer. So for me, it's like, I would have loved to have had somebody, and also financially as well. I think often, people in those circumstances maybe don't have the financial resources to get the help they need. So yeah, it's just being, for me, it's just being able to be available for people, because I think everybody should have somebody that they can reach out to if they've been through something traumatic, and just being that person that I wish I had by my side back then. So I think that's what drives me forward anyway.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
I would say very similar for me. And, I'd been through these external, overwhelming events that both physically and psychologically ran roughshod through any coping mechanisms that I may have had. And as a result of that, I found a number of different strategies that allowed me to bounce back. And I wanted to be able to share those with people because, I had great support through the NHS, and you pretty much exhausted all of the Western medical models' ways of dealing with what I was going through. And then I found these other things, some of which, you've mentioned were cane and ecology, but a really huge recognition of the ecologists themselves. I had 2 experiences with ecologists that probably gave me more closure, more support, more insight than I'd had of 18 months of being in that Western medical model. And I just wanted to offer that back as well in the same way as Melanie.
It's interesting what you both are saying, because usually when we hear talk, podcasts or people talk about trauma, they're talking about the issues, the symptoms. And I think it's really nice to maybe instead talk about the solutions, because that's what people are really looking for in the end of the day, solutions to the trauma that have experienced. And maybe let's start when we talk about these unusual solutions with what Melanie said, the support, the difference of actually having support. Is this right after the trauma or long term, or how do you see the support?
Yeah, Gabby, I would say that of support in the first, I mean, depending on the trauma, if it's something very traumatic, the person can obviously be in shock for, you know, that initial first period. But I think the first kind of 72 hours, to have some kind of support, to feel validated, somebody to normalize what that person is feeling, is really, really important. And I think studies have shown that having that really early support can actually prevent longer, more serious symptoms, occurring. It can help prevent things going into, things like PTSD, for example. If that initial interaction is there and people feel that they have that initial support, to me that is crucial. Unfortunately, many of the clients that will be coming to us will not have had that, and that can make things a little bit more complicated. I think it can make recovery take a little bit longer because they've already got into some coping mechanisms and they've got used to using those coping mechanisms. And so then we have to, start working on ways to find the more healthy coping mechanisms before they can let go of this. Because you can't, if somebody's relying on a mechanism, a coping mechanism, and you take that away from them, they've got nothing else to hold on to. So we need to work with building their resources first of all, before we can then, start moving them away from any, unhelpful coping mechanisms that they've had. So so the support, ideally, if they can get support very early on, I think that's brilliant, and that really, really, really is helpful. But at any point down the line, it just might take a little bit more of work, I think, to get people to the same stage. Would you agree, Alec?
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head for me. Normalization is so important when we're thinking about trauma. Yes, it normally involves intense helplessness, intense horror, sometimes, but not always, intense fear. There's blame, there's shame, there's loss of control, the fact that you weren't in control of a circumstance. But most of this is a common reaction to an uncommon series of events. And if you've got people around you who can help you with that, so I've worked with TRIM, traumatic risk incident management, and without doubt, that's a 72-hour window. All the planning and strategizing of that will take place in the first 24 hours, and then we wouldn't speak to somebody until 72 hours. But as you said, many people don't come back for years. The important part is that trauma is still as fresh in their mind as it was on the day it happened. So whilst we're not in the evidence-based sort of catchment window, there is enough evidence to suggest that with the right support and help, people can process it. And the important thing is any event is only potentially traumatizing. It will depend on the person and their understanding of what happened. And the chances of it being something traumatic with no long-term implication comes down to the fact that they've had support and the opportunity to process it and a way of making sense of it that is comfortable for them, all of which you just mentioned. And that can happen immediately or it can happen 20 odd years later. And that was my experience. I mean, when I found out about TRIM, I was sitting there thinking to myself, how many times do I wish I had that available to me? But actually the practices and the processing of it is still relevant even years after the event.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned two things here: the support and the straight away the support, the help at the start, and also that trauma is processed by different people different way. So sometimes somebody would have what we as lay people would say a very traumatic experience and they're not traumatized, and then there's something in our mind, something small, and we can't understand why a person suddenly is so traumatized by it. And Melanie, you had a lovely example, a personal example, if you don't mind sharing, to actually bring this into practical experience terms, what we just talked about, if you don't mind sharing about the accident.
Yeah. Of course, Gaby, I'm more than happy to share. So I was involved in a very serious car accident where I fractured my spine, had a lot of, quite serious injuries. And so, basically it was on a cold and wet English morning driving to work, and a water pipe had burst. And so there was black ice on the road, and I just literally just lost control. The road curved and I lost control of the car. And I had a head-on collision with a truck coming in the other direction. So it happened very, very quickly. We're talking a couple of seconds, and it was all over. So by the time I regained consciousness, the truck driver was already by the side of my car. He assured me that, they had called the ambulance, help was on its way. A lady stopped in a car behind me, and she came and sat in the passenger seat next to me, and she was with me, until the ambulance came, talking with me. Thankfully, she told me to, I'm sure you're going to be fine, but just try not to move too much, which, as you can imagine, with a fractured spine, was very good advice. So, anyway, I get rushed to the hospital, and then my family come, my friends come. It was a very, very traumatic event, but I wasn't traumatized by it, because from the very second the event happened, I had people there, people assuring me that I was going to be okay. And then at the hospital, I had friends and family, they were there to support me. And so I didn't ever feel traumatized by that event. I didn't have the nightmares. I didn't have flashbacks. It was inconvenient. It wasn't a pleasant experience, but I kind of got through it. But my husband, I'd been married 5 months when the accident happened. So he was the one that got the call from the hospital saying, your wife has just been brought in from a serious car crash. And so, he's, coming to the hospital as quickly as he can, not knowing what he's going to see when he gets there, not knowing the extent of my injuries. So for him, that was, really, really stressful. And then as things progressed, I found he was really struggling. I had all the support, everything, everyone was rallying around me to make sure I was okay, everything I needed. And he was kind of left in the cold. And so he was the one creating all these stories like, oh, what if, and she could have died. And so his sense of safety, of security, that was being damaged, and he had nobody to talk to about that. He had no support. And of course, even from me, I put my hands up. I didn't even think at the time. Back then, it didn't even cross my mind that maybe he had been traumatized by that. My focus was on me, and to be honest, he started to drink. He wasn't going to work all the time, and I started to feel let down. I was like, I'm the one that had the car crash. I'm the one that was in the traumatic event. I'm the one that should be falling apart, not you. So it's just an example of sometimes, we have to be really sure who's actually been traumatized. What is the trauma? Because it's not always that obvious. And many times I think when somebody, maybe we ask that they share a story about something traumatic that happened to them, often it's not the full picture. They'll give us a timeline of events. They'll tell us the bits that they're comfortable talking about, but the real crux of it, the real trauma, often isn't spoken about. And it's the narrative is very devoid of often emotion, and they won't go into how they felt, that kind of thing. So I think that's something that's it's important to be aware of. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Ali.
Vicarious trauma is something that I think we really are only just starting to get our teeth into. I think there's been some resistance to it, and there's almost a sense, even from organisations, a little like you said, it didn't happen to you. Why are you struggling? And it kind of brings in this subject of moral injury. If something happens in an organization that you work for, even your country is behaving in a certain way, potentially in war, conflict, natural catastrophe, that goes against our moral compass, that causes injury to us. So that's a part and parcel of, could be military, frontline emergency services, etc. But you've also got the potential there of, a loved one, a partner, who starts to blame themselves. The accident wouldn't have happened if I'd done X, Y, or Z. There's this, and again, you mentioned the narrative. We make these stories up. There's a timeline of events, and if I could have done that better, or she should have said, and we create this whole thing that actually seems to alter facts about the matter and brings in all sorts of beliefs about an event that really weren't relevant to what happened. So it's the lack of processing, or a maladaptive processing of the event, that tends to lead to those longer term problems, as do maladaptive coping strategies, like taking to drink, or being laid up in your bed because you can't face the events of the day. So it's a huge area, and even, I suppose, within our fields, there's the potential for us to burn out if we over identify with a story. So to a certain extent, there's the bad thing that happened. How much of that do we really need to go into? Let's talk about how we process and understand and come to a good, healthy narrative and strategies that will help us spring forward into the future.
That's really interesting, because what I hear is that having not that support for the first 72 hours, we start telling ourselves stories, this narrative, where we literally get ourselves into a downward spiral, which actually almost de-traumatizes us as much as the actually original event.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's part of the human condition. I think if you look at animals, we have the shared kind of brain with the mammals, but we also have this prefrontal cortex at the front. So if you see like a zebra, for example, and a lion comes to attack it and it escapes, the zebra doesn't spend that next kind of 2 hours thinking, oh my God, what if? What if I tripped, or what if I didn't run fast enough, and if I don't, who was going to bring up my children, and what, the zebra doesn't do that. The zebra runs, it checks its surroundings. Okay, the lion's gone, I'm okay, I'm safe now, and it continues eating. It just ducks its head down and it'll start munching away at the grass. And unfortunately, as human beings, okay, it's very useful. I don't say that we don't need this part of our brain. That's our logic, kind of reasoning part of the brain. It's very, very important. But it can do us a lot of damage, because we can get stuck in these stories, and we make it even worse than it was. We escaped, there wasn't a scratch on us, but what if, and we create this narrative that then can go on to creating all these difficult symptoms for us, and cause a lot of headache for us. So,
and there's a fascinating book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers that touches on some of what you just said. But if you look at animals, you only have to watch wildlife footage. They have a close escape with something, and they always give themselves a big shake off and kind of reset themselves. Whereas not only do we not shake ourselves off, but we potentially reach out to people who probably through good intention build this story of, oh, well, what would have happened if this? And, you know, before you know it, you're contemplating all sorts of things, like the fact that you haven't got a well thought out 5 wishes, for instance, of how you you face your mortality. And those layers are actually potentially quite unhelpful when it comes to resilience. Anne Marston's definition of resilience is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, and going through these threats and significant events with well adapted coping strategies, some of which are things which you probably could say are in line with giving ourselves a shake off, taking some exercise, eating healthily, taking care of our nutrition and those kinds of things, which are actually quite the opposite. I mean, probably certainly in the military, frontline ambulance and policing, it was quite often, that was a close one. Let's not talk about it and go for a drink. Two of the worst things we could possibly do. We're not processing it, and we're using a numbing agent to help us exactly numb that so we don't think about it. Whereas thinking about it in the right circumstances, right context, right people would actually very quickly set you up on a path to, you know, so when the zebras all gather and they start saying, oh, you know, you wouldn't have been able to come to that nice new patch of grass we found, you can actually say, well, it's not about that. You know, the thing happened. This is what I've done. So I've learned, you know, it's something that perhaps you could take on board as well. And the recipient of the trauma is helping to pre-pave and preload other people's knowledge of how they can cope if something similar happens. And for me, that's another part of this role and this desire that I have in working with people, is to say it is just a potential problem, but look what opportunities it gives you to grow. Look what opportunity it gives you to reassess some elements of the way you are and the way you want to be with others. So there's a gift in it as well. Our mindset just needs to adapt to the fact that it has that. And I think currently, given everything in our Western societies, that's not the way we look at it at all.
Yeah. Melanie, yeah.
And I'd just like to say, I think it's important to say that, you know, the threats today aren't the lion attacking us. The threats can be very subtle. It can be not getting likes on our Facebook posts. It could be having to do a presentation and feeling that you're going to be humiliated, or you're going to make a mistake and people are going to judge you. You know, these are the kind of things that we're up against in today's society continually. So, you know, we're not worried about the lion attacking us, but it's these more subtle kind of things that can often get missed and people don't realize that they're there. And I think, according to something that Alec was saying as well, I think this kind of giving people that hope is so important as well. Letting people realizing that, you know, they can get past this. There is help available. They can go on to, I like to use the term, lead a life worth living. You know, if you've been through a lot of trauma, you know, you can often get to that point where you just don't see the point anymore. You're coping with so many different symptoms and so many debilitating things that, you know, life just seems to be a struggle. So I think it's really important that people get that hope. And I think one thing that I found really interesting, I did from the book, from one of Bessel van der Kolk's books, and probably when Body Keeps the Score, I'm not sure which one it was, I assume it's that one. And he talks about when the World Trade Center happened. And he was in the area, and he had a friend of his, and they had actually been there and they'd witnessed it when the two towers went down. And the guy was really concerned about his son, who had witnessed this event, and he said, like, please can you come by and just have a chat with him just to see if he's okay, if he's coping with it. And when he went there, the boy had drawn a picture. And he'd drawn the picture of the two towers, and there was kind of flames coming out. And he'd even drawn the people jumping from the windows. Yeah, so he'd seen everything that had gone on. And so Bessel said to him, okay, but what's this down here in the corner? And he said, oh, that's a trampoline. Yeah, the boy had drawn a trampoline, yeah, so that in his mind, if something terrible like this ever happened again, they would be saved. So he had found a solution, yeah, and to me he'd found hope. He'd found a way of something like this happens again, there's a way to get around it. There's hope. There's a solution. So that to me, I think out of the whole book was the one part that really kind of always sticks in my memory. I think that's a very important thing to be able to offer to people.
It's such a powerful point, and I remember that part of the book very clearly. And one of the things that we know about trauma is that people who have some role in, air quotes, saving themselves have better outcomes. So that can come later down the line when you perhaps learn about your maladaptive coping strategies, confronting them, seeking help, whether that be professional or through peers, and working it out. And you're absolutely right about the life worth living. I don't want to tell my old man story, but I reached that point where it didn't seem like it was ever going to be worth living, and it was a case of enduring, having to go on because son, other commitments, etc. But at some point, the information that I needed reached me, and I had the opportunity to change and grow. And now I can't I won't willingly put myself back to remember that situation in its bleakness as it was, because there's so much on the other side. Yes, the bad things happened. I'm never going to unmake those, but the way I think about them and how I've dealt with them is so different. It's so important that people have that. So creating your own, so kind of talking about the empowerment dynamic here, becoming your own coach, catalyst, etc., and making those steps forward, a little bit like the boy. It's, yes, I've seen it, but had that been in place, people could have saved themselves. And I think he went on to say that young man didn't actually ever show any long-term symptoms from witnessing that. So it's incredibly powerful that he was instrumental in their escape, because they kind of fled the scene, understandably. He saw solutions around it, and then he took action. He communicated it, and he had the opportunity to be supported by people who had had similar experiences. And I'm not suggesting that it's helpful to sit and kind of morosely go over the details, but the evidence base does show that if you're speaking to someone who has had similar experiences, weren't necessarily in the same incident, but their coping gives us something to work towards. And that is such an important part of life after healing from trauma.
It's very interesting what the two of you are saying, because there's another layer to it, especially if it's a traumatic event where maybe our life is completely changed, right, through an accident or something happened, and our life has been altered from what it was before. It's not only coping with it actually event, it's even harder to look forward into the future because we also have to adapt to a new lifestyle. So there's also grief coming in, the grief of the life we had before, for example.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say, Gabby, it's not just grief of the life we had before, it's the grief for the person we were before. Because I think a lot of trauma survivors feel that they lost a part of themselves. They feel they can't really connect to themselves after the trauma. Something, you know, they feel they're a different person. So they're either desperately trying to get back that old person, or they kind of feel that kind of, I'm lost, I don't know who I am anymore. I mean, I do a lot of parts work. I do a lot of work with internal family systems, and in that modality, they teach us that the self, though, is still there. Whatever you want to call the self, your core, your soul, whatever it is. That's, you know, there's a part of you that from the day you were born is always there. It's always present. And sometimes, yeah, you can lose connection with that. And that's because there's so many parts coming up after trauma that are trying to protect you. They're trying to protect you ever being in that situation again. They're trying to stop you being hurt again, stop you being vulnerable. So these parts are all coming up and protecting you. So that it's very hard for the self to actually come forward and be center stage again. But it can happen. If you know, people can do the work, and slowly they can get these parts to kind of take a step back or take on other roles. So I think that's a really important point, that, you know, people do often feel very lost after trauma. So I think we need to really work with clients to get that connection back, to connect to themselves and also to the body as well. A lot of times, you know, if something, you know, if there's been abuse or anything like that, they can even start to hate their body. So there needs to be you know, a lot of work needs to be done there for them to start to feel comfortable again with themselves, with their body.